Hello, second grade Smarties, and welcome to Wit and Wisdom Module 2, Lesson 24. So today we are going to be exploring both versions of the legend of Johnny Appleseed. But first, let's think about our questions we are trying to answer as we move through our journey of the American West. So here's our big pizza question. Here's our essential question. What was life like in the West for early Americans? Our pizza slice question. This is the question we're trying to answer after looking at both versions of the legend of Johnny Appleseed is what life lesson can we learn from the story of Johnny Appleseed? And our content question, and I like to think of this like taking a bite of pizza, is what does a deeper exploration of comparing versions reveal in two Johnny Appleseed texts? So today what we are going to do is we are going to be comparing the story of Johnny Appleseed by Aliki to Stephen Kellogg's version Johnny Appleseed. So we are going to be comparing the content, so the text and the illustrations to find what is the same, but also what is different. So as we are thinking about the story of Johnny Appleseed and the real life story of John Chapman, like we explored yesterday, we can use our timeline to help us understand what was happening in the early United States during the life of John Chapman. So remember, we talked about this yesterday in our last lesson, that this green section shows us the timeline information about John Chapman. So we added that John Chapman was born in 1774 and that he died in 1845. So between 1774 and 1845, John Chapman did a lot of great things to help early pioneers, the Native Americans, and the animals he encountered. So there were things that he did during his time that he was alive. But let's look at what happened while Johnny Appleseed was alive. Look at this section. In the Ed puzzle, I want you to tell me what is an event that happened when Johnny Appleseed was born. So look at this section right here. When John Chapman was born, what is something that was happening while at the time that John Chapman was born or before that? Tell me in the Ed puzzle, what is something that happened before or when John Chapman was born? So we can use our timeline to see that during the time before John Chapman was born and the time John Chapman was born, Indians and buffalo lived together. Remember, we talked about that in the Buffalo Are Back and the book Plains Indians. During this time before and when John Chapman was born, Indians and buffalo lived together. They took care of each other. This is also the time when settlers started coming to the Great Plains. They started traveling west. Okay, so these are events that happened during the time before John Chapman was born and the time when John Chapman was born. Look at the time when John Chapman died. What are some events that happened in history around the time that John Chapman died? Okay, look at where my mouse is going. In the Ed puzzle, I want you to tell me, looking at the timeline, what is an event that happened in the early American West when John Chapman died? Tell me in the Ed puzzle. So looking at our timeline, we can see that new people came west on the Oregon Trail. Remember, in the version by Aliki, we talked about how John Chapman was born in Massachusetts. He lived on the frontier in Massachusetts with his family. But at that time, people in Massachusetts, in the East Coast where John Chapman lived, they started moving west to that open, empty, and free, I'm going to say free land. So remember, also was inspired to plant apple trees out through the West. So though we do not know in either version if he got all the way out to Oregon like Olivia Clark and her family, but we do know that he started traveling west to plant apple orchards. So looking at the events that happened around the same time that John Chapman was born, how does John Chapman's life help us understand more about early America? So think about the two versions of Johnny Appleseed that we've read. What is something that we know about from those stories that has also happened in the other books we've read? What is something that is the same, for example, between John Chapman and Olivia Clark's story in Journey of a Pioneer? What is something that is similar between those two? What is similar? Tell me what you're thinking in the Ed puzzle. So, understanding John Chapman's life, we understand that he was an early American settler that was inspired by the pioneers going out west and used his inspiration around his love for apples and apple trees to go out west and to plant orchards. So think about the things that are happening at this time. John Chapman, he loved everyone. He was kind and generous. That's the lesson we learned about him. We learned that he helped early American settlers make settlements or homes on his journey through the West. We also learned that he met Native Americans or American Indians, and he helped them by giving them apple seeds and herbs for medicine. So John Chapman was in the middle of all this history. So as we are thinking about the real John Chapman, we can also think about the legend of Johnny Appleseed. So Johnny Appleseed is a legend that is based on the real person, John Chapman. So here is our goal today. Are you ready, Smarties? Okay, so first off, I want us to give ourselves a little brain massage. Give yourself a little brain massage because we're going to be doing some deep thinking. So I'm giving myself a nice little brain massage. Oh, yes, that feels so nice. Okay. Whew. All right. So here's our goal. We are going to use evidence from both texts, The Story of Johnny Appleseed by Aliki and Johnny Appleseed by Stephen Kellogg, to help us understand the legend, the message, and the life lesson behind the story of Johnny Appleseed's life. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to look at illustrations and the text of both books, and we are going to compare them to find what is the same and what is different. So the first thing that we are going to compare is John Chapman's interaction with pioneers. So the first couple slides that we see are going to be from the Johnny Appleseed story by Stephen Kellogg. Woo, getting tongue-tied again. So we are going to look at a few pages from the second version we've read, and then we're going to look at the pages from The Story of Johnny Appleseed by Aliki. So be thinking about what is the same about how they interacted with pioneers and what is different. All right, so be looking at the illustrations and listen to the words. Meanwhile, pioneer families were arriving in search of home sites and farmland. John had located his orchards on the routes he thought they'd be traveling. As he hoped, the settlers were eager to buy his young trees. In 1812, the British incited the Indians to join them in another war against the Americans. The settlers feared that Ohio would be invaded from Lake Erie. It grieved Johnny that his friends were fighting each other, but when he saw the smoke of burning cabins, he ran through the night, shouting a warning at every door. John went out of his way to lend a helping hand to his new neighbors. Often he would give his trees away. People affectionately called him Johnny Appleseed, and he began using that name. He particularly enjoyed entertaining children with tales of his wilderness adventures and stories from the Bible. Pause. Okay, what is something that we learned about John Chapman and how he helped pioneers? In the puzzle, I want you to use evidence from the text and the illustrations to think about how he helped pioneers. Tell me what you saw. So in Kellogg's version, we learned that Johnny Appleseed, or John Chapman, he loved to tell his stories to children about his time in the wilderness. He helped the pioneers build their homes. In this version, he warned the pioneers or the settlers about the war that was coming from the British. And we also learned that he sold his tree sapling, his trees, but he also gave them for free. And our illustrations support that. We see his little seedling trees. We did not see this, I do not think. I do not think we saw this in a Leakey's version. If we did, make sure to correct me. But in this version, we see John Chapman giving his seedlings to the pioneers to build in their settlements. We see the illustrations of him telling stories and building homes. Let's look at a Leakey's version. As he walked, John planted seeds. He gave a small bagful to everyone he saw. Soon, everyone who knew him called him Johnny Appleseed. That's something that's the same. Sometimes Johnny stopped for many weeks helping the pioneers. They cleared the land, they built homes, they planted rows and rows of apple trees. When they were finished, Johnny walked on to help others, but he always came back to see his friends. Johnny did not like people to fight. He tried to make peace between the settlers and the Indians, for he believed that all men should live together as brothers. All right, in a Leakey's version, how did Johnny Appleseed help the pioneers? Tell me in the puzzle. So in this version, the first version we read, he gave bag full of apple seeds to everyone he met. He also helped pioneers clear the land, build homes, and plant rows of apple trees. We also learned that he told stories to the children. Another thing that is different in this version is that he tried to make peace between the Indians and the settlers. All right, so thinking about both texts, what is something that is similar between the first version and the second version? What is something that happened in both books? You can use this chart to help you think about what is something that happened that was the same in both books. I want you to tell me in the Ed puzzle, what is something that you saw was the same in both books? So something that we saw that was the same is that in the first version, he helped clear land, build homes, and plant apple trees. And he also he gave a helping hands to the neighbors by building homes. We know that he loved to tell stories to the children and that he gave his seeds in his apple trees away. That is something that was the same. Now I want you to think about what is something that was different. What is something that is different that happened in a Leakey than what happened in Kellogg? What was something different that happened in a Leakey's version? Tell me in the Ed puzzle. So something that is different that happened in a Leakey's version is that Johnny Appleseed tried to make peace between the Indians and settlers. And looking at Kellogg's, something that is different that happened in this text that did not happen in a Leakey's text is that he warned the pioneers of the British coming to fight them. So both versions had things that were similar, but they also had things that were different. We can also use the illustrations to help us think about what was the same. So in the pictures, we saw smiling faces of the pioneers and of Johnny Appleseed. In a Leakey's version, the pictures were kind of simple. There weren't as many details, but in Kellogg's version, there were lots of details in the illustrations. All right, now we are going to be talking about the ending of both versions. So remember, in the ending of both versions, Johnny Appleseed gets sick. But they both have different endings. So we're going to be looking at the illustrations and the text to talk about what is the same with both endings and what is different. It made Johnny's old heart glad when they welcomed him as a beloved friend and asked to hear his tales again. So here's Johnny Appleseed. He's looking a little older. When Johnny passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep up his work. Then, in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the first time in his life. Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin, and a few days later, he died there. So that was Kellogg's version. What happens to Johnny Appleseed at the end of the second version? What happens to Johnny Appleseed? Tell me in the Ed puzzle. In this version of the story, he becomes 70 years old. He's older, so he can't do much of his work, and he dies from illness. Okay, let's look at Aliki's version, the first version we read. As he was walking among the trees one day, Johnny Appleseed fell to the ground. He was very ill. After some hours, an Indian mother and her son passed and saw Johnny lying in the cold. Quickly, the boy ran for help. Johnny was carried to their village, not far away. For many days, he lay ill with fever. The Indians gave him medicine and nurtured him. And one day, Johnny Appleseed opened his eyes. He smiled at his Indian friends. He knew they had saved his life. He saw that the sun was warm and the frost had left the trees. Spring had come at last, and Johnny was well again. But he never forgot his friends and went to see them often. So in Aliki's version, what happens with Johnny Appleseed at the end of the story? Tell me in the puzzle. So in this version of the story, an Indian mother and child find Johnny Appleseed laying in the snow, and the Indians help nurse him back to health, and he continues on his journey. Okay, so let's compare those two. What is something that is the same in both those versions at the end of the story? What is something that is the same with both? Tell me in the puzzle. So something that is the same with both is that Johnny becomes ill at the end of the story. But there were two really big differences in that story. In Aliki's version, Native Americans help him get better, and he keeps going on his journey. Where does Johnny Appleseed go in Kellogg's version? So let's look back. In this version, it says, when Johnny passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep up with his work. Then, in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the first time in his life. Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin, and a few days later, he died there. So we know that both versions are the same, that spring was late and there was snow and Johnny Appleseed was sick. In Aliki's version, Indians take care of him and nurse him back to health. What is the big differences in the second version we read? What happens when Johnny Appleseed becomes ill? Where does he go for shelter, and what happens to him? Tell me in the Ed puzzle. So in this version, he asks for shelter in a settler's cabin, so a pioneer's cabin, but in this version, he dies. So this is really different from Aliki's version. Also, looking at the illustrations, both of these illustrations show a snowy setting, but in Kellogg's version, it was very stormy. And Johnny Appleseed looks a lot older than he did in the beginning. But in Aliki's version, he doesn't look very old, right? So both versions tell the story of Johnny Appleseed. And there are some similarities and differences. In Aliki's version, we talked about the lesson that we can keep in our heart, in our mind. And we said that the lesson that we learned was that you should be kind and generous. Do you think that Kellogg's version, the second version we read, does it also support this lesson? Yes, right? So we learned from Johnny Appleseed in the second version we read that he was kind to everyone he met, and he was generous with his time, his stories, and his apple trees, right? His seedlings. So I want you to think about these two stories. Even though there were some differences, what is something that is the same with both versions of the story? What is something that we can take away from that is the same in both stories? Tell me in the puzzle. The lesson, right? The one big thing we can learn about Johnny Appleseed from the two stories, the two legends, is that, and the real life of John Chapman, is that he was kind and he was generous to everyone. All right, Smarties. So we are getting close to the end of our time with Johnny Appleseed. Last week, or 2 lessons ago, we started a digital book and we answered the question, what lesson can we learn from Johnny Appleseed? And we're also going to add a fun fact page. Today, what I want us to think about and what we are going to do in a little bit is how we can improve our books. So today, we are going to go back and look at our digital books that we made in Book Creator. And I want you to reread your books. Good writers edit or make changes to their writing to make it easier for the reader to understand. So here is what I want you to do. I want you to go back and I want you to check that for every sentence in your writing, you used a new page. You didn't put all of your writing on one page. You made a new page for every sentence. Okay, so we should have a cover page, a topic statement, 2 details, and a conclusion. We should have at least 5 pages. Okay, we shouldn't have all of our writing on one page. I also want you to check that in your sentences, you checked the spelling of your words. You made sure that Johnny Appleseed's name had capital letters at the beginning. I want you to check that you started every sentence with a capital letter and that you ended with punctuation. But here are some things that I want you to think about with adding details. What are some things that you can add to your book to make it look more interesting? Could you add pictures? Could you add illustrations? Could you add sound effects? Ooh, maybe you could explore adding sound effects to your book. And what are some things that you can do to make your book easier for the reader to enjoy? What are some things that you can make more enjoyable or easier for your reader? All right, and as always, we finish a lesson with a deep dive. So today we're going to be talking about the word shelter. Say shelter for me. Shelter. So here is what I'm going to do. On this page, there's a lot going on. So on this page, we have a couple pages from Kellogg's text of Johnny Appleseed. I am going to read it, and I want you to think when you hear the word shelter, what are the words around it doing to help us understand what that word means? Also, what are the illustrations doing to help you understand what the word shelter means? Okay, so listen closely, get really close so you can see what's going on, and be thinking about the word shelter. When a storm struck, he found shelter in a hollow log or built a lean-to. On clear nights, he stretched out under the stars. Over the next few years, John continued to visit and care for his new orchards. The winters slowed him down, but he survived happily on a diet of butternuts. All right, so let's go back to this first page. So if you look really closely where I am pointing my cursor, there's that hollow log, a lean-to. It says that on clear nights, or he found shelter in a hollow log or built a lean-to. A lean-to is a type of shack. Okay, so looking at this illustration, he built a kind of shack out of a log, but he found shelter. So, shelter. Looking at the illustrations and the words around the word shelter, what do you think the word shelter means? Tell me in the puzzle. So we can use the words around our vocabulary word to help us understand. So for example, the word lean-to tells us it was a type of shack or a type, not a house, but a type of place where he slept in. And he slept in this lean-to on stormy nights, but on clear nights, he just slept under the stars. So when would he need shelter? On stormy nights. Think about it. Would you want to sleep out in the open on a stormy night? No. So his lean-to was a place where he was safe. So a shelter, our definition, where we can find where do we go to find definitions of words? The meanings of words. In an informational book, we would go to the glossary, but if we don't have a glossary in our book, we can go to an online dictionary. Remember, dictionaries are places that gives us definitions or meanings of important words. So the definition of shelter is a safe place to protect someone or something from harm. Oops. All right. So when we are exploring a new vocabulary word, or when we are exploring words that we don't know the meaning of, we can use something called a Freyr model. Say Freyr for me. Freyr models are helpful tools when trying to figure out how to understand the meaning of a new word and then how to use that word in our writing. So look at the middle. In the middle, it has the word shelter. In the Freyr model, we would have the definition. So in the last slide, we learned that a shelter is a safe place to protect something or someone from harm. This side would give us characteristics of a shelter. So characteristics of a shelter would be safe. We would maybe say it was sturdy. Would broken be a characteristic of a good shelter? No. What about dangerous? Would that be a characteristic? No. So using the knowledge of what I just said, what would be a characteristic of a shelter? Think about the words that I just said that were good characteristics and not good characteristics. What is a characteristic of the word shelter? What kind of place is it? Tell me in the puzzle. All right. And what are some examples of shelter? So shelters are any place that can keep a person safe from harm. So for example, I am in a good shelter right now. I am in a school building. Your home is a type of shelter. A tent is a type of shelter. And what is another example that you could think of for a shelter? Tell me in the puzzle. So examples of shelters are examples that match the definition and meaning. A Freyr model also helps us think of non-examples. So what are examples that are not shelters? So the first shelter I can think of is a swimming pool, especially during storms. Have you ever been to the pool and it starts storming and you have to get out? Why do you have to get out of the water? It isn't safe, right? So a non-example would be a swimming pool. What's another non-example? Maybe an open field where you don't have any place to hide or keep you safe. What is an example that would not be a good shelter that you can think of? Tell me in the puzzle. All right, so let's look at characteristics. So some characteristics are people need it to stay safe. It's housing, it protects, and it can be expensive or cheap. Some examples are a hollow log, a lean-to, cabins, a building, teepees, and teepees made from bison hides. Who slept in teepees made from bison hides? The Native Americans. So some non-examples of shelter are walking outside in a storm, sleeping under stars, sitting outside at a campfire, being outside in the rain or snow, and sitting watch outside the tents. Ooh, who had to sit watch in Journey of a Pioneer? Who sat watch while people were sleeping? The men, right? The pioneer men. They sat watch to protect their people in wagons. All right, so using our knowledge of what a shelter is and what examples of a shelter is, I want us to listen to this last page, and I want you to answer this question in the puzzle. Why did Johnny Appleseed ask for shelter on the second page? When Johnny passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep up his work. Then in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the first time in his life. Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin, and a few days later, he died there. In the puzzle, I want you to tell me, why did Johnny Appleseed ask for shelter? Tell me in the puzzle. So Johnny Appleseed asked for shelter because he was outside in that snowstorm. So he needed a safe place to probably get warm, to be comfortable, and to try to get better because we knew he was ill. All right, Smarties, that is it for lesson 24 of module 2. Remember, keep that growth mindset. Good learners do hard things. I will see you very soon with another lesson, our final lesson about Johnny Appleseed. Happy learning, Smarties.